Let's open our Bibles. If you turn to the 24th chapter of Acts, we're kind of getting down the home stretch, aren't we, in our study of Acts? Acts chapter 24. In the first century, Roman lawyers were probably more known for their oratorial skills than they were of their knowledge of Roman law. It was whoever could out-rap the other dude was the one that usually won. And I guess maybe nothing's changed too much on that regard. But, sometimes you may notice this when you watch the political pandering that goes on in our country. But sometimes when you don't have the truth on your side, words can make a pretty good substitute. You just kind of use a lot of words and use a lot of multi-syllabic words. And, you have some style to sort of suppress the substance, or you roll with a little flair to fog up the facts. And we finished last week with the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, agreeing with 40 different guys, and we're not quite sure who these guys were, but there were 40 different guys who had vowed that they were going to take out Paul. They wanted to take out the Apostle Paul, and they took an oath that they were going to assassinate him. Their plot became known, and so the Roman tribune put Paul with a large contingent of soldiers, and they did this forced march all the way from Jerusalem to end up in Caesarea, some almost 60 miles, and in order to protect Paul. And in chapter 24, we're going to see that the Sanhedrin is going to lawyer up. Okay. This doctor was vacationing on the Riviera, and he met an old lawyer friend there, and he asked him what he was doing there. And so the lawyer replied, he said, "Remember that lousy piece of real estate that I bought a few years back?" He said, "Well, it caught fire and the insurance paid off, so here I am." By the way, what are you doing here, the lawyer asked. And so the doctor replied, and he said, "Well, you remember that lousy real estate investment that I made in Mississippi? Well, the river overflowed, and here I am with the flood insurance proceeds." And so there's a little bit of puzzled silence from the lawyer, and he said, "Gee, how do you start a flood?" Yeah, okay. Going to be a hard crew again tonight, huh? After about 5 days, verse 1, Ananias and the high priest came down with the elders, and a certain orator by the name of Tertullus came down with him, and they gave evidence to the governor against Paul. All right, you didn't like that one? Here's some signs that you just hired a bad lawyer. If he begins every sentence with, as Saul Goodman and Lionel Hutz always say, and if you know who those two guys are, shame on you. Or whenever she says, "Your Honor," or he says, "Your Honor," he always makes those little quoting marks in the air. If she keeps quoting the legal case of Godzilla versus Mothra, you probably need a new lawyer. Or if just before the trial, he whispers, "The judge is the one with the little hammer, right?" Or if every time he hears the word briefs, he giggles, you probably need a new lawyer. So Tertullus, he's this lawyer that they hired, or an orator that they hired in order to present their case before the leadership there at the Roman provincial capital of Israel, which was Caesarea. Tertullus is the diminutive form of the name Tertius. We read about him in Acts chapter 16. He's one of the guys that is saying hello to all the Roman guys when Paul was closing up his book to the Romans. And it just simply means third. His name means third, which is, the name Secundus is the Roman name for first. Primus, the name Secundus is the Roman name for second. And then Tertius would be third. And then Quartus would be the Roman name for number 4 or fourth. And we see some of these guys by those names in the New Testament. It's a little uncertain. Oftentimes, most of the Bible or the Roman historians say that these were just slave names, that if somebody was born into a slave family, that rather than naming them and wasting good names, they just gave them numbers. But I was doing a little research this week, and it really wasn't that uncommon to name kids after some sort of ordinance. Or if it wasn't like first, second, third, and fourth, they think that originally, before they hijacked the names of the months and named them after the Caesars, like July and August and so forth, they were actually names of the months that they were named after. Like, for example, we have names like April, May, October. I mean, we have names like that we name our kids after, and August, yeah. So maybe it was something like that, but anyway, orator. The New Testament word for orator is the word rhetor. Our word rhetoric comes from that, and these were guys that would be very adept in the skill of rhetoric, being able to take words and spin them and use them for their own advantage. And so here he comes walking into this, was a courtroom, but it was a court. He comes walking into this place, and I mean, he's rolling smooth. He's got his Xenia toga on with the color-coordinated sash, and he's got his high-polished sandals and his Varagama scroll bag, and I mean, he's just really looking good, he says, and when he was called upon, in verse 2, Tertullus began his accusations, saying, and here's what he's going to say: seeing that through you we have enjoyed great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I begged you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us. And I mean, it was probably even Felix was just going, please, I mean, as Scott always says, gag me with a spoon. I mean, it was just so thick and so over the top, because none of that was true. I mean, not only was it not true, but it wasn't true that the Jews thought it was true. They did not like him. He was not a good ruler. I mean, Felix put the booger in Boogerhead, okay? He was not a good guy. He was born a slave. And so he had those kind of origins. He was the younger brother of a guy named Paulus, who was the Claudius, who would later would become Caesar. Paulus was his childhood friend. You know how they would take the rich people in those days. They would get somebody to be your kid's companion. Paid friends kind of a deal. But they grew up together, and he was Claudius's best friend. And so at some point, Felix was freed, probably by either Claudius's mother. But he was freed. Then he was granted citizenship, and then later he was given this governorship over Judea, which was kind of like not really an honor, in Roman thinking. That was just kind of, they kind of viewed, nobody wanted to go to Judea. But they sent Felix there because they figured they could get him out of their hair and he couldn't cause any trouble. But as I said, he was very corrupt, very evil. We looked at last week the Sicarii, the guys that were these assassins, the guys that would have have dagger will travel kind of guys. And even though they originally started off as like these super patriots, that they wanted to kill Romans for the sake of restoring the nation of Israel, getting the Romans out of town, sort of a thing. After a little while, they kind of became guns for hire or daggers for hire, and he would oftentimes employ these Sicarii to take out his enemies, and he wasn't a very good guy. He sowed the seeds of rebellion there in Judea that would later blossom into a full-on rebellion that would take the Romans over 4 years to suppress. And Felix was kind of the guy that sowed those seeds. But anyway, Tertullus is kind of buttering him up before he says the few words that he would like to share by his courtesy. For we have found this man a plague, talking about Paul. So this guy is a plague. creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader. And he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and anybody that was a ringleader of anything out of Nazareth was not good. Remember, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, that was the mindset throughout all of Judea, and he figured he could probably score a few points by saying not only was he a leader of this, he was a member of this sect of the Nazarenes, which was meant to be a slam, but he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. The word sect here in the New Testament language is the word hairesis, and our word heresy comes from it. Now, we think when we hear the word heresy today, there's a certain idea that comes into our mind that usually has something to do with bad juju doctrinally. They say he's teaching heresy. That's not the meaning of the word hairesis, though. Generally, it has the idea of something being a section or a subset of something bigger. Just like you got this, and within that you have a smaller group. Kind of like we would view denominations within the body of Christ today. That's generally how it was accepted in the first century. But sometimes it would be used to describe a particular party or a division, of within that group. And that's kind of how he is using it, because they were, in that time, they just saw Christianity as the sect of Judaism, but it wasn't a good sect. It was a divisive sect within that party. And he says he even tried to profane the temple. And we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law, but the commander Lysias came by and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come out to you. By examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. And so to understand the backstory, you need to go back and read the previous couple of chapters before this. But he's saying, talk about spin. This is tremendous spin that he's putting on the events of what happened there in Jerusalem. And it says, and the Jews also assented. He's continuing, all the Jews were agreeing with us, maintaining that these things were so. So that's Tertullus' opening argument. And as we saw last week, Paul was going to choose to represent himself. And so then Paul, after the governor nodded to him to speak, he was probably the whole time Tertullus is speaking, Felix is sitting there rolling his eyes, and then finally he just kind of looks over at Paul and he said, would you please start talking now? And so Paul stood up and he said, inasmuch as I know that you have been many years the judge of this nation, I do the more abundantly answer for myself, because you may ascertain that there is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. So as in Paul's opening argument, as he is addressing Felix, he says, he's trying to think, okay, what can I say that's good about him? I can get on his good side. I don't want to sound like Tertullus did. I don't want to do all that drivel, but I guess, you've been a governor for a long time. That's the best thing he could say. And then he says, but all these things that he's saying, that I was causing these riots and gathering all these guys for sedition and rebellion and everything. It hadn't even been 2 weeks since I first went to Jerusalem. When I first showed up, that hadn't even been 2 weeks yet. It had been 12 days. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone. I wasn't arguing with anyone in the temple. I wasn't inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city. Not only did I not do anything like that in the temple, but there's no record, no account of me causing any kind of problems anywhere in the whole city. Nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. It almost sounds as though, I wonder if the emphasis isn't on the word now here, where Paul is saying, and neither can they prove the things which they now accuse me. Like the charges are kind of growing as the days go on. They're trying to find other things they can trump up to bring against him. But he says, I confess this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, got my slides off, okay. According to this way that they call a sect, so I worship the God the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. So we've seen a few times now that they didn't, they were first called Christians in Antioch. We saw that early on when there was this great revival of Gentile Christians going on up in Syria in the city of Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, and they were first called Christians there. But it wasn't really called Christianity in those days. They just simply called it the Way, or the followers of the Way. And that was originally kind of a slam, like you think you guys are going the right way, kind of, you think Jesus is the only way to heaven, and so they said it as kind of a slam, and they kind of, well, yeah, it is the way. There's a broad way that leads to destruction. There's a narrow way that leads to eternity, and we're taking that narrow way. And he says, so I confess to you openly that I follow the way. In fact, if my charge is for being a Christian, if that's what they're accusing me of doing, is being a Christian, following the way, following Jesus, guilty. Guilty as charged. And then he uses, which they call a sect, and he uses that word hairesis once again. The Old King James, if you're using the Old King James, those translators render it as the word heresy, but it's probably more as not quite as strong of a word as how we think of it today, just more of a subsect. But he said, I'm guilty. If my charge is following the way of being a Christian, guilty as charged. For I have hope in God. Notice that what he says here in verses 15 and 16. For I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept. So any confusion with me and the Jews in this? No, we both have hope in God. That there will be a resurrection of the dead. Well, the Jews believe that too. So any contradiction between us and Judaism? No. That there will be a judgment of both the just and the unjust. That's pretty orthodox. In fact, all of this you can find, Paul would say, in the Old Testament. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Paul had tested the claims of Christianity and found them to be valid. He had been one of the biggest opponents of Christianity until he came face to face with Jesus. And I think these three things here that we have in verse 15 and 16, there's three things that he gives that provides a very perfect description of a Christian. The first one is hope in God. A Christian is somebody who hopes in God. And throughout not only the Old Testament but the New Testament both, we see that being taught, don't we? The second one is that believe that there will be a resurrection of the dead. A Christian, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that if we don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, we are of all men most pitiable. Paul says, I have this belief in the resurrection of the dead. And then lastly, a Christian will always strive to have a conscience without offense. And I think sometimes we can seek so much to have no offense that we can kind of taint our conscience. And sometimes we can say so much that I want to have a clean conscience that we don't care who we hurt in the process. And he says, I strive to have a conscience without offense. And after many years, verse 17, I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation, and in the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob or with tumult, and they ought to have been brought here before you to object if they had anything against me. Paul had collected, we've seen over the last several weeks where he had done this collection of the churches of Achaia and Macedonia, the Gentile churches, and he'd heard about this famine going on in Jerusalem. So he collected a bunch of money. They even put together a large posse for Paul to travel with to bring the money back. And once he had gotten to Jerusalem and purified himself, he went to the temple to worship. And he said, that's what I was doing when they arrested me. And he's reminding his accusers that we were just bringing money back to provide humanitarian aid for the Jews in Judea, in Jerusalem, because of the famine. And then he says in verse 19, and they ought to have been here before you to object if they have anything against me. The guys that were saying that I was doing something bad in the temple, they ain't here. Ananias and the rest of the council guys had shown up, but the people that were actually accusing him of of defiling the temple by bringing Tychicus into, I think, wasn't it Tychicus that he brought into the temple? Supposedly brought him into the place that beyond the court of the women. And they weren't here. You know, I can't remember. I know this is going to come as a shock to some of you, and especially those that know me very well. This is going to be a very big shock. But I've got my critics. I know. I'll give that a moment for you to breathe again, because I know that's quite a shocker. But there have been people that have said things negatively about me. But I can't remember the last time they said it to my face. You know, I always hear about it. I mean, it comes back to me. You know, like you talk about the little bird. You know, it comes back to me. But it's so all of you that have said something negative about me, I know. So there, okay. So you know, Paul is saying that's what these guys should be here. They should. I mean, that's what this event is for, is to bring it out. And yet they had to hire this highfalutin lawyer to come and do it, and they're not even going to show up. Or else let those who are here themselves say if they have found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council. Unless it is for this one statement, which I cried out concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am judged by you this day. Remember, when he's standing before the council that was made up of Sanhedrin and or Sadducees and Pharisees, and the Pharisees believe in the resurrection, the Sadducees don't. And so if there's anything they can say that I said wrong, it's when I said that. And that's only the Sadducees that would disagree with that one. But when Felix heard these things, having a more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings, saying, when Lysias the commander comes down, I'll make a decision on your case. Now, it's kind of important to know, and this is going to come out later in the study, but a really good friend of Felix's was this guy, probably it was this guy that we saw earlier back in chapter 8, I think it was. There was this guy named Simon. Simon was his first name, was his second name, and magician was his third name. Simon T. Magician. And he was a good friend of Felix's. And more about him later. But it says that he had a more accurate knowledge about the way. He knew something about Christianity. And as we're going to see, he's married to a Jewess, a Jew lady, and he knows quite a bit about, even though he's not a Jew, he's a Gentile. He's been set there by Rome, and he knows something about what's going on. And so he commanded, verse 23, he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or visit him, or don't prevent them from visiting him or providing for him. And as we saw last week, he's staying there at the summer palace of Herod the Great. Herod the Great had built this tremendous digs right there on the shore of the Mediterranean. He even built a great breakwater offshore so that he wouldn't have to be bothered by waves coming up on his property. And he built this indoor swimming pool and had indoor plumbing and all. I mean, it was just very opulent kind of a place that Herod had bought or built, some almost a century previously. And that is where the Roman leaders had set up their territorial capital. And that's where Paul was being housed. And he was free to just kind of roam about the palace however he wanted to. He could have friends over, wanted to invite them for dinner. That was fine. Go for a dip in the pool. That was cool too. And that's the kind of imprisonment Paul was dealing with during this time period before the conclusion, before the verdict was given. It kind of reminds me of Proverbs 16:7, where Solomon writes, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. One of the questions that I have, though, and we asked this earlier when he was first being charged there in Jerusalem. But one of the questions I would have is, we were told that there were these great throngs, these myriads of Jewish Christians there in Jerusalem, many Jews who had turned to Christianity, and we don't see hide nor hair of them. Where were they? Why didn't they come to speak on his behalf here in Caesarea? And you say, well, it's a long journey. It's almost 60 miles. Well, Ananias, who was an old guy, he made the journey. They may have, I don't know. But I'm certain that there were many, because remember, this is where Philip, the evangelist, was living. That's where he was holed up there in Caesarea. And so there were many believers there in Caesarea, and so they were coming and seeing him. But I just wonder where his Christian brothers and sisters were. Well, verse 24 says, after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, so after some days, he's coming back, and now he's got his wife Drusilla with him, and she was Jewish. And so he sent for Paul and heard him concerning faith in Christ. So here's a little bit of background. This would be, and I know this is history, and I know you guys hate it, but I'm going to give it to you anyway because it's free and because you need it, okay? So the Herod family is, if you remember the old TV show Peyton Place, this was Herod Place. This was, it was just, there was Herod the First. He's the Herod the Great, and he's the guy that we hear of first. And the guy that was the ruler of Judea at this time was Herod Agrippa the First. He was the grandson of Herod the Great. And he's the one that we read about in chapter 12 that had to suffer. Remember, he was giving this speech, and they said, "Oh, it's not the voice of a man; it's the voice of a God." And he took the glory for it. And he goes, "Oh, thank you for noticing." And so God smote him, and he died a very painful death by worms. We do the thing about where we'll talk about when people die, the worms go in, the worms go out. But his case did it in reverse, and he was married. Herod Agrippa was married to this gal named Cypros. Yeah, there we go. And they had this daughter named Drusilla. Now, she had originally been betrothed to this guy, this Roman guy, at the age of 14. Okay? And it didn't work out. In fact, her dad wanted her to marry this other guy that was going to make a little more money. And so even though they had been betrothed, which in that culture was the same thing as being married. You had to get divorced to break the betrothal, but just hadn't been consummated yet. And so she was married to this other guy that was a little more well off by her father's behest. And then her dad died not long after that. And it said that her brother, Herod Agrippa II, gave her, after the dad died, he gave her to this other guy to be married to. And when she was married to this guy, I'm sorry. She was married to this Roman dude, but Herod Agrippa, when Felix first came down to Judea, he was so smitten by her, and his friend was Herod Agrippa, the son of the first Herod Agrippa. You all still with me? You guys are so glazed over. I apologize, but this is Herod. We've gone from Herod Agrippa the I to Herod Agrippa the II now, and he was the friend of Felix's, and he convinced this guy named Simon to kind of do the razzle, wiggle the nose, something, to conjure up a thing to cause her to leave the husband she had now and get hitched to Felix. And that's how all of that came about. Now, as a qualifier, Josephus says that it was Simon the Cypriot, which in the book of Acts he says he's Simon from Samaria. That may be, might be talking about two different Simon the magicians. That's possible. It's not an uncommon name in that day. Or it could be that he was born in Cyprus and then he moved to Samaria. There's any other number of explanations for it. So most likely it's the same guy, but maybe not. And she was at the seasoned age of 20. in our story now. And so she's heard about Paul, and she wants him to come in, and wants Felix to bring her in, and so she can hear more about what he has to say. And so he says in verse 25, now as he reasons, so he's actually got this captive audience of the procurator, the leader over Judea. You remember Pilate in the days of Jesus? Well, here we are 2.5 decades later, and this is one of his successors and his wife, and they're wanting an audience of 2 to hear Paul. He said, come and share with us about the gospel. Tell us about Christianity. And so as he's reasoning about about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid. And he answered, go away for now, and when I have a convenient time, I will call for you. Go away for now, and when I have a convenient time, I will call for you. Unfortunately, the word afraid here in the original language, did I have that up there yet? It didn't get there. Okay. There really is, for somebody who does not want to surrender to the lordship of Jesus Christ, when they've been presented with the gospel and they would want to hold on to their sins more than they want to hold on to eternity, there's never going to be a convenient time. And what I mean by that is there's never going to be a time where the person says, you know, I like what you're saying, and not now. I'll come back later. Come back to me later. You know, I got some wild oats to sow, and once those have been sown, then I'm gonna settle down, and then I want to hear again. That's never going to happen. There's never going to be a convenient time. Now, God may, in His love, in His absolute love for us, He may allow circumstances to bring us to a place where we'll call out to Him. You know, maybe through health issues or something like that. Or, you know, I've seen the Lord use cancer to get people's attention. Or maybe some sort, you know, going through a divorce or some life-altering crisis like that brings you to a place where you find yourself on your back and you're looking straight up. He'll do that because He loves us so much. But for the sinner to come to the place where they just think, you know what, I've had enough of my sin. I'm going to set that aside now. Okay, Jesus, what did you have for me? That's not going to happen. Now is a convenient time, Jesus. Would you like to come in? That's not going to happen. It never happens. Because and here's why. There's a story, and I'm not real sure. I read it on the internet, so I'm pretty sure it's a real story. Okay, and I mean, it got retweeted 1.5 million times. So I mean, it's got to be true. But the devil called this council with a bunch of his senior demons to ask them. He said, "What's the best way that I can mess up men? What can I do that could be the best way to get them to not turn toward God?" And so the first angel or first demon raised his hand, and he says, "Tell them that there's no heaven." And the devil thought about it for a minute. He goes, "Well, no, that won't work." I mean, first place, God loves them so much that He's put eternity in their hearts. They know that there's something that lives after this life. They know that there's an afterlife. And He put this yearning inside of man to look for that, to seek for that. And so to tell them that there's nothing, that you just die, you live and then you die, and that's it, that's not going to work. They'll never buy that. And so the second demon raised his hand. He said, "Well, tell them there's no hell then." And the devil thought about that for a minute, and he goes, "Well, that's really a pretty good idea, except they know that God is not only good, but He's also just. And that with all of the evil in the world, they just kind of know it in their guts that He's going to judge sin. And that there's got to be He's a righteous God. And they know that inherently. And so I don't think they'll buy that." And so then the third demon raised his hand. He said, "Well, then tell them that there's no hurry." And the devil said, "You know what? That'll preach. Because there's always tomorrow, you can always wait until tomorrow." That's the mindset. And so we buy into that. We think it's not convenient today, but tomorrow, maybe. And that has been the devil's biggest lie ever since the Garden of Eden. Paul came to them and he reasoned with them. The gospel is reasonable. It may be somewhat incomprehensible. I've been a Christian for 40 years now, and I still don't comprehend the height and the width and the depth and the breadth of God's love that's received through the gospel. It blows me away every day. I don't comprehend why God would love someone like me. I don't get that. But it's reasonable. It's believable. Even if they could, and so he's reasoning with them about just what I'm sharing with you and what you know about Judaism and the prophecies of the fathers and what you know about the nature of God. He was reasoning with them with all of these sort of things. And then he talked with them about righteousness. And even if they could come to the place where they would accept the righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, that through our surrender to him, if we would bow our knees before him, that he would impart to us the righteousness of his very son. And even if they could come to a place where they could receive that, this idea of the intemperance, or self-control. In fact, the only other place this word occurs in the New Testament is in Galatians, where Paul uses it to talk about one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. And even if, just looking at Felix and Drusilla and the lifestyle that they lived and the choices that they had made in life up to this point, he knew in his heart that even if they could go this far where they could say, okay, dear Jesus, please come into my heart. The idea of getting up and walking away from that encounter as being changed, as being truly born again, so that the person that they were before they bowed the knee is a different person once they raised their knee. Because he knew that there would never be a convenient time for that. It says that Felix was afraid. The word afraid here is the word emphobos. The word, word phobia comes from part of that. That's the Greek word for fear. But then with the prefix in front of emphobos, it means that he was scared out of his wits. He was very afraid. Just not afraid enough. He was very, very afraid. His knees were smoting, his teeth were chattering, but he said, it's just not convenient right now, so come back later. And then we know part of the reason here, because it says, meanwhile, verse 26, meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul that he might release him. He thought maybe Paul would, that's the way things worked back in those days. You grease my palm and things will be okay. Well, I guess that works out right today too, but he says, so he says that he sent for him more often and conversed with him. I mean, after all, Felix wasn't new. He'd been around the block. He'd seen TBN. He knew that all preachers were rich, and so he just knew all I had to do is just get Paul to come in, and one of these days he's going to offer me a bribe. And he kept bringing him over and over again, tell me a little bit more, tell me a little bit more, tell me a little bit more, but it never was a convenient time. It says in verse 27 that after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix. And Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. Now, what Luke doesn't tell us here in the text is that not only did Porcius Festus succeed Felix, but Felix got fired. The word kept coming back to Rome about just what a lousy procurator he was and what a lousy ruler he was, and they finally got fed up with him. I don't know if you've heard this statistic before. It's been pretty consistent through the generations, I think, at least in modern times, because I've heard it in almost every poll comes out, consistently bears it out. You know what the percentage of people who are Christians, look around the room today, and those of us who are Christians today, you know what percentage of us accepted Christ by the age of 18? 80%. That means everybody, every human being, at least every American who accepts Christ after the age of 18 falls in that 20th percentile. By God's grace, I'm one of them. And as you go on, the older you get, the more that number decreases, of what percentage of Christians. By the time you get to my age, I think it's like 5%. It's one of these things about the repeated actions, and you'll have to talk to our medical people to know more about this, because I'm not a doctor. I just play one in the pulpit. But there is a thing about when we do things, and then when we do them again, and then when we do them again, and then do them again, and this thing about repeated actions, it does something in our brains. It causes these neural pathways to be produced, and it's almost, you take somebody that's just first learning how to play a musical instrument, and it's pretty painful to listen to, right? And it's painful to watch too, because they're struggling to get every note, and they're looking at the sheet music, and they and they can't have any distractions, and then they start becoming so proficient at it that they don't even think about it. They can carry on. I used to have a secretary years ago, back in the old days of typewriters, and she was such a good typist. She could be typing copy while she's reading this copy and typing it, and carry on a conversation with me at the same time. Because this had become so second nature to her that she didn't have to think about it. Musicians are that way, where the instrument just kind of becomes an extension of their body, because these neural pathways, these things get kind of formed, and it just becomes part of our nature. It's not only musical instruments and typewriters that happens with. It can be any choices that we make in life. And repeated actions produce these pathways. That's why it's so hard for somebody that's addicted to drugs. It's so hard to get them off, because they've got these pathways that have been established. And the only way to do it is to establish different pathways. And that's why there's never a convenient time to hear the gospel. 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 and 2, Paul writes, "Now the Spirit expressly says that in the latter times some will depart from the faith, giving heed to deceiving spirits." There's no hurry. "Giving heed to deceiving spirits and doctrines of demons, having their own conscience seared with a hot iron." The reality is that Felix returned back to Rome in disgrace. Died an old man, childless, lonely, without anybody. Drusilla took her son and wanted to go on a shopping vacation, a shopping spree, and she went to this place by the name of Vesuvius. Have you ever heard of it? In AD 79, she was there, and if you've ever seen the pictures of Vesuvius when they uncovered it, there's a big volcano that came down, and it happened so quickly that you can see these images of people where they were just covered in this ash so quickly that they're like this, and then they dig away the ash, and you can just see these frozen figures in time, and that was Drusilla. She was one of those people that was found there. They both died without Christ. Because they never did see a convenient time. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. It might be on the outside chance that there's somebody here that has never, room full of people, could be. They never fully surrender. You never just come to the place where God, you just say, "God, I give up. Would you take over? I'm going to give you my life now." And he says, "Great, let me give you mine." Maybe you've never done that, and if that's you today, I really do want to speak to you today that don't wait for a convenient time. In fact, the Old Testament says today is the day of salvation. And if that was true in the Old Testament, it's even truer in the New Testament. If it's true in the New Testament, it's even truer today, because I think we find ourselves in those days that the Spirit expressly talks about. There's never going to be a more convenient time than right now. But then, for those of us that know the truth, we know this, and so we take what we have and we go from here. We get filled up. We've heard the word, and so we go back tomorrow to our jobs and to our schools and to our neighborhoods, and we go back in with the truth of the gospel, realizing that there's only a certain amount of days in which this can happen. And the day has come. There's going to be a Vesuvius in somebody's life. You know, we have no guarantees that when we pull out of here and pull out onto 66, we're not going to get hit by a semi-truck. No guarantees. Odds are that's not going to happen. Odds are pretty great that's not going to happen today, but maybe not forever. Or if not on 66, maybe on I-40. We don't know when our Vesuvius is going to happen. Or it might be that we just become so convinced in our ways that we become lonely and old like Felix was, and just disillusioned and disgraced. And we have the message of the truth. We need to take it to him. Because like Jesus said, the hour is coming when no man can work. Amen? Let's pray. God, we bow before you this morning in praise. We bow our heads before the King of Kings, before the Lord of Lords. Lord, you have extended your grace to us. You've given us your unlimited love, and it's unfathomable. What we have in you is just beyond comprehension. And yet every day that goes by is just another revealing, just another awe-inspiring, eye-opening event of how great and gracious you are. Thank you, Lord. Thank you for being faithful when we're not. Thank you for being so good to us. Thank you for your word and the time that we've had in it now. And I would especially pray that as we have these closing moments together, that you would send your Spirit to do even greater works. In Jesus' name, amen.